Russia's economy is not tearing itself apart, and that is uncomfortable reality for those hoping for a quick end to the war. That is the conclusion of The Guardian in an analysis by economics columnist Philip Inman. Despite sanctions, shrinking revenues, and the risk of lower global oil prices, the Kremlin has managed to restructure its economy for a prolonged conflict. Growth has stalled, labor shortages are severe, taxes are rising, and social spending is being cut. Yet the system has entered a state of controlled stagnation, allowing the war effort to continue. Oil revenues now account for just 25% of state income, down from 50%. The shortfall has been covered through higher domestic taxation and shifting the burden onto households and regions. The conclusion is clear. Sanctions are inflicting damage, but they are not yet decisive, which leaves Europe with the hard truth. There will be no economic implosion to end this war, only sustained military support for Ukraine and tighter enforcement of sanctions can change the trajectory. The Kremlin is increasingly operating in the so-called gray zone beyond open warfare, but with very real consequences. That is the warning from The Independent. According to the analysis, Russia is expanding its hybrid toolkit far beyond cyber attacks and disinformation, relying instead on arson, sabotage, economic schemes, criminal networks, and private actors who are not formally linked to the state. British intelligence believes this activity will intensify following signals from the UK, France, and Germany about potential troop deployments in Ukraine, as well as recent interceptions of Russian Shadow Fleet tankers. The core of this strategy is plausible deniability. Damage is done by intermediaries, allowing Moscow to distance itself from direct responsibility. The conclusion is clear. Europe is not facing isolated incidents, but a coordinated and expanding hybrid campaign. Putin stayed silent when the United States challenged him in Venezuela, and the silence was deliberate. According to the New York Times, the Kremlin avoided any public reaction to U.S. actions in Venezuela, including the seizure of a tanker flying a Russian flag. The reason is pragmatic. For Putin, avoiding conflict with Washington now matters more than defending Russia's influence in Latin America. Analysts say his priority is clear: the outcome of the war against Ukraine. To protect that objective, the Kremlin is careful not to antagonize Donald Trump. At the same time, Russia no longer has the capacity to project power on multiple fronts. The war in Ukraine has weakened Moscow's global position. The conclusion is simple. Ukraine matters more to Putin than Venezuela and more than Russia's global standing. Washington is now openly discussing concrete scenarios under which the United States could gain control over Greenland. That is according to Politico, citing European officials, diplomats, and security experts familiar with internal discussions around Donald Trump. The outlet outlines 4 scenarios being treated as practical options rather than speculation. The first involves political influence campaigns aimed at accelerating Greenland's independence from Denmark, allowing Washington to negotiate directly with Nuuk. Danish intelligence has already warned about foreign interference. The second is security and economical deal. If Greenland became independent, the US could offer a compact of free association, funding and protection in exchange for unrestricted military access. The third scenario focuses on Europe. Politico reports that US officials are considering linking Greenland to Ukraine, offering stronger security guarantees for Kyiv in return for European acceptance of an expanded US role on the island. The fourth and most extreme option is military action. Though NATO officials say such a move is not seen as imminent. Politico knows that even discussing these options has already raised concern across Europe. Kyiv says it remains in constant contact with US negotiators as Washington moves to finalize a peace framework to end the war. Ukrainian officials say communication with the United States continues on a near-daily basis, underlying that Kyiv remains fully engaged in diplomatic efforts and does not see itself as an obstacle to negotiations. The Trump administration is pushing to conclude a deal almost 4 years into Russia's full-scale invasion, with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner leading the U.S. negotiation track. While diplomacy is active, the military reality security on the ground remains brutal. Ukraine's general staff reports a successful overnight strike on the Zhutovskaya oil depot, a facility used to supply fuel to Russian forces. An assessment of the damage is still underway. The strike came just a day after Russia launched one of its largest attacks in months, firing hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles across Ukraine, killing at least 4 people in Kyiv. For only the second time in the war, Russia also used a new hypersonic missile, striking western Ukraine, a move widely interpreted as a warning to NATO allies.
Practically every day we continue to communicate with the American side. Today, Rustem Umerov was in contact with American partners again. This is our strategic task. The dialogue with America should be 100% constructive. Ukraine has never been and will never be an obstacle to diplomacy.
Why the United States has withdrawn from dozens of international organizations and why a future White House may seek to rejoin many of them. Washington says the move is not about turning inward, but about abandoning what it sees as an outdated and ineffective model of global governance. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the decision to leave 66 international organizations followed an internal review. According to Rubio, many of these bodies have become inefficient, duplicative, or misaligned with U.S. interests. He argued that institutions originally designed to promote peace, security, and prosperity have increasingly turned into bureaucratic structures with weak results, politicized agendas, and poor financial oversight. The message is clear: the era of automatic funding for international bureaucracies is over. At the same time, U.S. officials insist this does not signal isolationism. The Trump administration says it remains open to cooperation, but only with organizations that deliver tangible results and are willing to reform. Earlier this week, President Donald Trump signed a memorandum withdrawing the United States from 31 UN bodies and 35 non-UN organizations, including the Venice Commission, the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, and the Science and Technology Center in Ukraine. Analysts know the future administration may revisit these decisions, but for now, Washington is sending a clear signal the U.S. wants a leaner, results-driven international system. The United States has launched another wave of strikes against Islamic State targets in Syria, extending its response to last month's deadly ambush that killed 2 American soldiers and civilian interpreter. According to U.S. Central Command, the large-scale strikes were carried out with partners' forces and hit multiple IC targets across the country. The operation is part of a broader response ordered by President Trump after the attack near Palmyra, where 2 U.S. servicemen and civilian interpreter working with coalition forces were killed. A day before the strikes, Syrian authorities announced the arrest of ISIS military operations chief for the Levant, suggesting coordinating pressure on the ground both from the air and on the ground. The broader context is shifting as well. Since the removal of Bashar al-Assad in late 2024, the U.S. has increasingly coordinated not only with Kurdish-led forces, but also with Syria's central government. Damascus has now joined the global coalition against Islamic State. How people in Lviv reacted to the Oreshnik missile strike? Local residents say the impact did not sound like a typical explosion. Instead, they felt the ground shake, sudden, unfamiliar, and disorienting. People describe a muted sound and, above all, the lack of warning. There was no sense of the missile approaching. Ukrainian security officials later confirmed debris from an Oreshnik hypersonic missile in the region. Because of its extreme speed, there is little or no audible warning before impact. The sound comes after the strike. Residents also speak about the wider reality of living under constant threat, cold nights, shelters, and the need to protect children and loved ones at a moment's notice. This reaction, confusion first, understanding later, is what makes the use of Oreshnik stand out. Analysts say the weapon is designed not only to hit targets, but to unsettle civilians.
I heard a loud, shocking explosion. And, it's normal at this time of the war, to hear these things here. And it makes me concerned about, if we have the tools to fight against the Russians from America. I'm American, so I think about, do we have the Patriot missiles to fight these things? Do we have drones that can shoot these things? And Yeah, I just want everyone in the world to know that, Ukraine is strong and we don't care how many missiles you send.
Putin should be kidnapped and handed over to justice. That was the answer given by UK Defense Secretary John Healey to a hypothetical question about which world leader he would kidnap if he had the chance. Healey remarked during a visit to Kyiv in an interview with a Kyiv Independent journalist Chris York. The interview took place next to a residential building damaged by a Russian drone strike, just hours after one of the heaviest aerial attacks on the Ukrainian capital. Answering to the question, Healey said Russian dictator should be taken into custody and held accountable for war crimes. He referred to what he had seen in Bucha during an early visit to Ukraine and to the abduction of Ukrainian children he met in Irpin. The journalist admitted he was surprised by the bluntness of the response. The question was framed in the context of the case of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, cited as a precedent for bringing authoritarian leaders before justice. Large-scale anti-government protests continues across Iran, driven by soaring inflation, the collapse of the national currency, and worsening living conditions. Demonstrations have spread to multiple cities and regions and have persisted for several weeks. According to the human rights groups, at least 65 people have been killed over the past 2 weeks, while more than 2,000 protesters have been arrested. The true death toll remains unknown due to a nationwide information blackout and repeated internet shutdowns imposed by the authorities. Witnesses and rights activists report extremely violent methods of suppression. Security forces have used live ammunition against protesters, including in residential areas. There are also reports of children among the dead. Medical staff and eyewitnesses say hospital morgues in some cities are overcrowded, with bodies reportedly placed on the floor due to lack of space. Families of victims face obstacles in accessing information and retrieving the bodies of their relatives. Iranian authorities deny the scale of the violence and describe the protests as riots and attempts to destabilize the state. Meanwhile, international human rights organizations are calling for an independent investigation and an immediate end to the use of lethal force against civilians. At the same time, a new wave of large-scale protest is unfolding across the United States following deadly incidents involving federal agencies. The epicenter is Minneapolis, where a 37-year-old woman was fatally shot by an officer of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. The shooting sparked mass demonstrations, with thousands demanding accountability and investigation into the actions of federal agents. Tensions in the city remain high. The protests have escalated into clashes with police as demonstrators threw ice and stones and law enforcement used crowd control measures. Despite calls for calm from Minnesota's Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, local leaders accused federal authorities and Donald Trump of fueling the escalation. Governor Walz said that the deployment of thousands of heavily armed federal agents sharply increased tensions, with the fatal incidents occurring less than 24 hours after their arrival. In recent days, protests against ICE have spread to other U.S. cities, with activities calling for an independent investigation and changes to immigration enforcement practices. Thank you for watching. For more content, please subscribe.